On Friday, Jill and I had a nice time going around to a bunch of locally owned shops and stores as we looked for a few things for members of our family for Christmas. We really like to try to support our local businesses and local people as much as we can. And for the two of us, it's a nice opportunity just to have a little time together and to talk and to enjoy a nice lunch. It's totally stress-free. But shopping for some other folks this time of year it's not always enjoyable. It's not always nice. Sometimes it can be, in fact, very, very stressful for people. One man was going through the grocery store and he observed a woman with a 3-year-old girl in her shopping cart, and as they went down the aisle by the cookie section, the little girl began to, ask for cookies, and when her mother told her no, the little girl began to whine and to yell and all this, and the mother said very quietly, "Now, Ellen, we just have half the aisles left to go through. Don't be upset. It won't be that long." And the guy went on with his shopping, and he just happened to go by the same mother and her daughter going down another aisle where the candy was. And when she was told that she couldn't have any candy, then she began to cry. And her mother said, there, Ellen, don't cry. Only 2 more aisles to go, and we'll be checking out." And the man just so happened to end up behind the mother and daughter checking out. And of course, there's all the gum and all the stuff right there. And when the girl found out she wouldn't be getting any gum that day, then she began to burst into this terrible tantrum. And her mother patiently said, "Ellen, we'll be through this checkout in 5 minutes. Then you can go home. You can have a nice nap." And they went out, and the man followed them out. And as he walked out into the parking lot, he just wanted to compliment the mother. He said, "I just couldn't help noticing how patient you were with little Ellen." And the woman looked at him and said, "My daughter's name's Tammy. I'm Ellen." Patience doesn't come so easily to some of us. And, as always, I shouldn't make light of it, but it does amuse me somewhat that every time, it's December. Did any of you see on the news any of the stories about all the car accidents and the pileups, that have the first snow of the year, first storm of the year, and there's always it's like everyone forgets how to drive. And, you can't drive the same way in snow. You've got to be patient. You've got to leave a little more room. And, And we, at least, we know what's coming, too, now. I mean, that's all the news is the weather, with commercials. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with Nathaniel Philbrick. He's a really good author who lives over on Nantucket. He wrote Mayflower and In the Heart of the Sea about the tragedy of the whale ship Essex. And both those books really chronicle the perseverance, the toughness, the determination of earlier residents of this region. And I did laugh when I read Philbrick's comments about kind of the first snowstorm of the season. And he used the word crybabies to describe people's reaction to a December snowstorm, one that set no records. It came as no surprise. And Philbrick said, "The fact is, once you get used to these modern conveniences and luxuries, even the mildest inconveniences become an epic tale of deprivation. Perhaps our threshold will be so diminished that our version of the Essex disaster and the Mayflower will be the drive home from the mall in 2 inches of snow." The more difficult our circumstances, the more challenging our life appears to be, the harder it can be to hold on to patience and to waiting on God. The harder it can be to persevere through that difficulty, that hardship. And that's true for us. And it was also true for John the Baptist. If you sit down and read through the Gospel of Matthew, you see that John the Baptist, who figures very prominently in the opening chapters, exits the stage in chapter 4, verse 12, after he's arrested. And he isn't mentioned again until chapter 11. And John was arrested and thrown in prison because he had the courage to tell Herod, the ruler, that it was wrong for him to take his brother's wife. Herod, like most rulers, didn't handle criticism well and responded by arresting John and throwing him in the dungeon, in the prison, in the fortress Machaerus, which is in the mountains near the Dead Sea. And just as the prophet Elisha had opposed King Ahab and Queen Jezebel, John had spoken against Herod, and this is one of the ways that Matthew points out that John the Baptist was the forerunner of the Messiah, because the Jewish people believe that Elijah has to come and prepare the way for God's anointed one to come. Now, for a man like John the Baptist, who had spent so much of his life outdoors, in the wilderness, his spiritual vision and his understanding of his call all came to him out in the wilderness. Can you imagine what it was like for someone like him to be in the confinement, the darkness, the stench, the filth of a cell in a dungeon? It must have been agonizing. And with little to do but to think and to reflect on his life, which he knew could end at any moment. We can understand why John might be wrestling and wondering, had he done the right thing? Had he said the right things? And we can easily imagine him struggling with depression and discouragement and doubt with all that he was facing. And I wonder if he was trying to hold on to his faith and his courage, pondering if he could die in peace knowing that he had fulfilled his purpose and his mission in life, or whether he had been mistaken. Was he wrong about Jesus? And had he squandered his life? Because Jesus wasn't exactly fitting the profile of the mighty one who would burn the chaff with unquenchable fire that we heard about last week. And so we don't know. Had John begun to question whether he had seen the real Messiah? Or was John, with characteristic humility, seeking to help his despondent followers to see that Jesus was actually the Christ and not John himself? Because John was a charismatic and impressive individual. He had thousands of followers. And even for centuries going forward, there would be those who would continue to worship John the Baptist. John had seen Jesus at his baptism, and now he wants confirmation that Jesus is who John thought he was. So listen to Matthew chapter 11, beginning at verse 2. When John heard in prison what the Messiah was doing, he sent word by his disciples and said to him, "Are you the one who is to come, or are we to wait for another?" Jesus answered them, "Go and tell John what you hear and see. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the poor have good news brought to them. And blessed is anyone who takes no offense at me." As they went away, Jesus began to speak to the crowds about John. "What did you go out into the wilderness to look at? A reed shaken by the wind? What then did you go out to see? Someone dressed in soft robes? Look, those who wear soft robes are in royal palaces. What then did you go out to see? A prophet? Yes, I tell you, and more than a prophet. This is the one about whom it is written, 'See, I am sending my messenger ahead of you, who will prepare your way before you.' Truly, I tell you, among those born of women, no one has arisen greater than John the Baptist. Yet the least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he." It's important to understand Jesus' answer to John's question and our answer to John's question. John's question reflects both a positive and negative response to Jesus. Are you the one who is to come? Some people were saying, yes, I think so. The question, shall we wait for another, reflects the perspective of, well, it seems like we've got to keep waiting. And the greatness of Jesus to me is seen in how he responds to John the Baptist. He doesn't seem the least bit offended by John's question. He doesn't get mad. He doesn't arrogantly or state his credentials or his power or his authority. He doesn't say, of course I'm the Messiah. What's the matter with you? Jesus' response is indirect. He points to his deeds. He points to the changes that are happening in the lives of people all around him who come in contact with him. We wish Jesus had said to John's disciples, let there be no mistake. I am the one and the true Messiah of God. That would have been great. That would have just cleaned it all up. We could go eat cookies. But his answer is, go and tell John what you hear. Go and tell John what you see. In other words, his words and his deeds reveal who he is to those who have eyes to see and ears to hear. Have you ever, I was talking with a few people about this last night, about the importance of reading the Bible with your imagination. Because it makes the Bible come alive. It makes it more three-dimensional. So have you ever used your imagination to consider what it must have been like around Jesus when he was doing all the things that he says in these verses that he did? The ecstatic shouts of the blind who could now see, the color of a piece of fruit, or the sparkling in the eyes of a friend. The deaf who were screaming and shouting and whispering just to hear the sound of their own voice, and then falling silent to hear the songs of the birds, the sound of the wind, and the voices of their loved ones. Have you ever seen one of those videos where a child, they're able to give a child hearing who hasn't heard, and they hear for the first time, and their eyes just about pop right out of their head? Imagine that going on around Jesus all the time. Did Jesus want John's disciples to go tell John about the people who were dancing and running and jumping, who had been unable to move or to walk? Did Jesus want John to know of the awestruck joy of the dead who had been raised? I would have liked to have seen that. And how their loved ones wept and cried with disbelief. Maybe Jesus wanted John to know that in the eyes of God, the poor are never forgotten or despised or demeaned. So all around Jesus, there must have been this incredible and stunning array of sights and sounds to amaze anyone who witnessed them. And it's almost as if Jesus is saying, see what I am doing for others. What could I do for you? And then Jesus says one of his least known Beatitudes. You remember we started the fall with the Beatitudes? And we know blessed are the peacemakers and blessed are the pure in heart. But this Beatitude you don't hear quite as much, do you? Blessed is anyone who takes no offense at me. Why would Jesus have to say that? Blessed is anyone who takes no offense. Who would be offended by Jesus? On the surface, that seems puzzling. But if Jesus is who he says he is, then his power and his words are life-altering and also, to some people, threatening. Jesus wasn't crucified on a cross like a common criminal because he was a moral teacher who had a good way with words and liked telling stories. It was the power that Jesus displayed that made him a threat to Rome and to many other people. And each of us has to answer John's question about Jesus for ourselves. Who do you think he is? Is he the one you're waiting for, or are you waiting for someone or something else? Now, it's interesting to me that in Matthew's gospel, when John says, "Should we wait for another?" that word that's translated another, Matthew uses one word in Greek, and Luke uses a different word. And Matthew's usage, but not Luke's, can also mean, should we wait for one of a different kind? In other words, John's asking, should we be waiting for a different kind of Messiah than what we're seeing in you? Because maybe John wasn't anticipating a Messiah who was doing acts of compassion and healing. Because John, back in chapter 3, if you remember last week, he was anticipating more fiery judgment. And maybe John has to adjust his expectations because in Jesus, God is acting in ways that John did not anticipate. And Matthew uses that same word again just a little later in Matthew chapter 11 and verse 16, where Jesus is replying to the people who have been so quick to criticize him and John the Baptist. If you're in religious leadership, you get used to being criticized. It says in verse 16, "But to what will I compare this generation? It is like children sitting in the marketplaces and calling to one another. We played the flute for you, and you did not dance. We wailed, and you did not mourn. For John came neither eating nor drinking, and they say, he has a demon. The Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they say, look, a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. Yet wisdom is vindicated by her deeds." Jesus answered John's question by pointing to what God was doing through him and telling John's disciples to draw their own conclusions. As for our answer, if we follow Jesus' example, we'll invite people to reach their own conclusion about who Jesus is as we share what he has done for us and the difference he's made in our lives. Perhaps Jesus wasn't exactly what John thought the Messiah would be. But Jesus was fulfilling the prophecies of Isaiah 29 and Isaiah 35 and Isaiah 61. And in Isaiah 52 it says, "This is the time..." Strike that. Jesus' reply is a way of saying, this is the time of fulfillment that was prophesied by Isaiah. And in Isaiah 52:7 it says, "How beautiful upon the mountains are the feet of the messenger who announces peace, who brings good news, who announces salvation, who says to Zion, your God reigns." We have the opportunity today to be those messengers who bring good news to others. So I want you to imagine if you were the one tasked with going back to John the Baptist. What would you tell him? What would you say about all that you have seen and heard that causes you to have faith, that causes you to have hope, even in times of discouragement? We are the ones who can go and tell people that Christmas is the celebration of the one who came to show us a God of love. We are the ones who can go and tell people that Jesus is the one the world has been waiting for and longing for, and that the Christ who was born so long ago can still live in and through each and every one of us. May we continue to be Christ to one another, and may we live our lives so that we will have things that we can share, that we have seen and heard, that give us hope that God is with us. Please join me in prayer. God, we thank you for the gift of your word. And we pray that you would give us faith and courage as you gave those to John the Baptist in prison. In his dark moments, his dark night of the soul. And God, for anyone who is feeling discouraged, depressed, or doubting today, God, would you pour your Spirit out upon them in a fresh and a powerful way to give them hope, to give them strength, to give them healing. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.